Welcome everyone to the Wilmette Institute's regular webinar series, which has as its purpose to highlight the immense diversity of the teachings of the Baha'i faith and the ways they contribute to the contemporary world, particularly to the prevailing discourses in our society today. Today, the topic we're going to be covering is called Advancing Global Coordination in Dispute Resolution Institutions. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Shahla Ali joining us today from Hong Kong. That's why we are broadcasting at this particular hour, way too late for Europe and Western Asia, but just about right for the Pacific Basin, East Asia, and the Americas. Shahla Ali is a professor and associate dean international and the director of the program for arbitration and dispute resolution at the Faculty of Law at the University of Hong Kong. Her work centers on questions of governance, dispute resolution, cross-border dispute resolution and development in the Asia-Pacific region. She holds a BA degree from Stanford University in international relations and in the Chinese language, which was a good choice considering you were going to Hong Kong, I guess. And of course, then a JD and a PhD in jurisprudence and social policy from the University of California at Berkeley. So with that, I want to welcome Shahla today. Thank you so much for joining us. Shahla, we're delighted to have you here and delighted to have you giving this presentation. I will stop sharing my screen now and we will share yours and you'll be able to get started. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Robert, and to the Wilmette Institute and also Chitra Golestani and others who organized this webinar. And I've been following the work of Wilmette Institute and seeing such a rich tapestry of topics and speakers and relationships with various academic institutions. So it's really a great pleasure to join that community and conversation today, and also to be joined by some friends I see from various parts of the US. And I see my mom here, so good evening to my mom and some dear friends from around various parts of the US. So I'm going to share my screen, and what I had in mind for today was to very briefly touch on a project that just completed about a year ago. It was a 3-year project, and to try as briefly as I can to summarize that project and then leave as much time as possible to keep the space open for discussion and consultation and hearing your thoughts. So this was based on a book project. It resulted in this book here. I have my blur screen on, but it's called Forming Transnational Dispute Resolution Norms. And it came out about a year or two ago. And I think when, my dear sister-in-law, Chitra, I see she's joined as well. She was asking about this project. And I think what was interesting was that what inspired the project was something that I think we're all familiar with, which is this idea that we're seeing our process of global integration intensifying. And we see that we are moving in a direction towards greater coordination. And the needs, and I think this passage from the Baha'i International Community, I think really summarizes very well some of the dynamics that we see, and also some that were reflected also in this study. So I'll just go ahead and read this passage. It says that each stage in human history, more complex levels of integration become not only possible, but necessary. The demands of the present moment are pushing existing structures for facilitating deliberations among nations, as well as systems of conflict resolution beyond their capacity. And this is a statement called a Governance Befitting. And then further in that document, it says, while significant progress has been made towards advancing global order, recent events demonstrate that current arrangements are no longer sufficient. Integration and coordination must be extended further. And so what we're going to try to do today in this very brief discussion is to look at what are some examples of where we see this process at work? What are some of the developments that we see within some of the systems of lawmaking that have emerged that show that where the limits are and how what efforts are being taken to try to expand and integrate the participation in these decision-making bodies? And so I'm going to briefly touch on, let's see, going to the next slide, some of the background of this project and what the key findings were and how they relate to our understanding of some of the dynamics that Shoghi Effendi, for example, has described as we move from childhood to the adolescent stage and then finally to a stage of more integrated, cohesive global structures. Okay, so this is a lot of words and I'll try to break it down. I'm so sorry for this very texty slide, but this is sort of the summary of the whole study, the whole project. So I'll just go through some of it. So how we expand this inclusivity in developing our global conflict resolution norms and principles has become an area of increased attention. So we've seen how there's been a growing body of work that looks at how these norms or principles of law, how they're developed beyond countries, so at a transnational level, integrating both bottom-up and top-down analyses. So how principles of both bottom-up decision-making and top-down decision-making integrate. But at the same time, I think people recognize the limits. So there have been calls for expanding the representation in these lawmaking institutions at two different levels, at this horizontal level between states and international organizations, and at the vertical level between these global institutions and individual citizens and NGOs. So how to expand the representation both horizontally and vertically is something that there's been a lot of discussion about in various circles. And so the aim of this particular project is to look at one example of how Regional Center was formed to try to address some of these concerns, how it has emerged to try to reach more deeply and more specifically into a regional context, which is, in this case, the Asia-Pacific context. Okay, so what is the entity that we're looking at? So there is a particular, we're all familiar with the United Nations, which emerged in this century, and it has many different branches. So the United Nations governs and tries to contribute to the coordination in the areas of health, in the areas of security, in the areas of trade, among many other topic areas. So this one subtopic that the UN oversees is the area of trade, and this one body that addresses this area of trade is called the UNCITRAL, which is the UN Commission on International Trade Law. So it's one commission of the United Nations, and it's emerged in the 1950s. It has a very interesting structure. So it's about a 60 to 65, 70 members, states are represented on this body. There's a certain proportionate representation from each region of the world, and the membership rotates so that there is a cycling of perspectives in this body. It's meant to be not too large so that there is a thoughtful discussion that's possible. The idea of having it 60, 70 is that people could really exchange views and hear other perspectives and really build on those. And then those perspectives represent various regional groups from around the world. So this, what's interesting is that those meetings and those discussions have generally taken place either at the UN the UN offices in New York or in Vienna. So these are two centers of discourse where these conversations take place. And in between this, there was a recognition that many of these decisions and these investigations could benefit from more engagement with regional participation from people within the various regions that are represented at this commission. And so there was an experiment taken around 2012. And the experiment was to say, well, why not create a regional branch office of this global UN Commission on Trade Law? Let's create one regional branch to see how it does. Does it increase the number of people within that region contributing ideas for how we can improve trade relationships and develop more cohesive norms to guide how we solve problems that arise in the trade context? So they opened a branch in Korea in 2012, which is for the whole Asia Pacific region. So basically it's, in our context, we understand there is a regional council in the US. There are a number of regional councils that help to advance coordination within the United States Baha'i community more effectively by working with local communities and areas. And so I think a similar process was taken here, which is let's have one regional center in Korea to represent the East Asian region to get more input and involvement and participation. And so the purpose of this study that I started about 4 years ago was to see, was it effective? How did it contribute? What were the contributions that were made to people's connection with this decision-making body at the UN? Were there more contributions, more ideas generated, more participation as a result of this center? And what are the implications then for opening other centers in other regions? So Latin America and Africa, the Middle East, for example, many regional areas which have maybe had more difficulty accessing New York and Vienna may have an easier time accessing regional bases where ideas can be shared more effectively. So that's the idea of this study, how, to look at this regional center development and see what its impact was and what was learned. Okay, so so this was 5 years after this regional center was established to see how whether or not it contributed to this decentralized engagement in global lawmaking. Just to give a bit of background about what type of law we're talking about. So in our national context, we're familiar with hard law, which is a binding law, which is passed usually by a parliament or a government. At the global level, we don't have a parliament at this stage yet, or a enforcement body. So what we see often is soft law, meaning norms and principles that are developed, and countries are encouraged to adopt these for themselves. But it doesn't have the force of hard law. In a few cases, we have a few conventions which give rise to law that transcends national borders. But in many cases, the nature of this law is a soft law, which means their ideas, their principles, countries can choose to adopt them or not adopt them. And this is up to each country. Okay, so the question, as I mentioned, is how do these regional centers contribute to developing this kind of soft law, and how do they, whether or not they contribute to increasing participation in developing some of the ideas and approaches that are taken at the global level. So what we did for this project was we looked at a number of data points. So we looked at, for example, working groups. So what's interesting at the UN level, there are logs and notes and reports that are kept in the UN database system. And so there are different working groups that deal with various issues under this UN Commission on Trade Law. One of the working groups deals with dispute resolution tools and instruments, and developing, so in some cases, conventions or laws that bind the members, or some of these are principles that suggest how disputes can be resolved between countries. So all these logs and notes are kept in the UN database. And so I went through them basically before this regional center was set up and after, to basically count by hand the nature and the level of participation by the East Asian region. After it had its center, it had access points for NGOs and individuals to access this center to share its ideas. Did the number of ideas and contributions increase or decrease? So that was one aspect, counting interventions and counting contributions. The second part of the study was to survey people who participated in this process to hear from them whether they saw from their own observation, whether they felt that they had greater access after this regional center was established to share their views and to share best practices through this intermediary. So what are the findings? So this is like the summary of the whole thing. So the finding was, yes, in fact, this regional center did contribute to sort of a greater engagement and connectivity with some of the learning, the rich insights that we're developing within the East Asian region. And so for one aspect, the counting of meeting notes, the counting of interventions, from before this regional center was set up to after, you could see that there was a 63% increase, overall increase in the number of regional inputs made at this global level after this regional center was set up. There was also an increase in the number of observers who attended and participated and engaged in this lawmaking process. And then from the survey, the last part, those who were observing this who were engaged in this process of deliberation, they perceived about 32% increase in terms of what they saw as their role in contributing ideas to this UNCITRAL process after the regional center was established. So as compared to before, their participation level increased by 32% in terms of their perception of their ability to access and share input. So these were the key findings. And so what are the takeaways then? What do we take away? There is a benefit from regionalizing, if you will, the global lawmaking institutions to having some of their deliberations functioning or operating more at the regional level. So this was one example just in the East Asian region, but the implication is that this would be an effective model to replicate, say in Latin America, say in Africa, and other areas where there has been historically limited representation in these global bodies, to ensure that there is more access to a wider range of viewpoints and perspectives, so that when global laws are being developed, it takes into account the richness and the diversity of inputs and experiences from various sectors. So this is the key takeaway. And I think it really reflects a passage that we understand from the Universal House of Justice in 2019, which says this diversity that characterizes the human family, far from contradicting its oneness, endows it with richness. And there's, and then there's this question. So we have this diversity. We have this idea that we are moving towards a greater coordination. What does that mean? So maybe I'll stop here, and maybe this is a good point to hear your inputs and ideas, and then we can have some further discussion. So I see that we have some friends joining us, and we have one. I don't know if that's a question. Oh, that's from the Wilmette Institute.
Yeah, I've got a question for you. I'm not sure whether you answer this or not. Is this the only regional body so far, or what did you say? There was one for the Americas and Europe, or something like that? I couldn't quite.
So this is the first one. So I think the idea being that historically, Europe and the Americas have had a very strong contribution and have made a significant contribution to the development of these global institutions, and they are in fact housed their global centers, like the UN's sort of office basically is in New York. It has also an office in Vienna. So there's been a sense that there's been a significant contribution from these areas of the world, North America and Europe. So it may be now timely to see how to kind of increase the access points to the deliberations at the regional level. So the East Asia branch was developed, in 2012. It was mainly because there was a contribution by the Korean government. Koreans said, okay, we like this idea. We're actually willing to sponsor it. So they said, we'll give you office space. We're going to give you even staff. That was significant in why, the decision-making leading up to its own formation. So the question is how to develop and generate the resource so that these other areas of the world could also develop their own regional centers as well.
One of my other questions was, well, why did it end up in Korea? So you answered that one. I was kind of curious about that. In addition to the fact that there's been a noticeable increase in participation and discussion, have there been any particular outcomes that you can mention that possibly flow from the creation of this particular regional body?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the areas that I think I observed just living in East Asia is there's a real sense of value for efficiency. So efficiency is highly valued. How can we economize, save money? That has its pros and cons. Sometimes things are done too quickly and there are costs associated with, doing things too fast. But in other cases, things can be done in a way that save people some time or, resource. And so there is a real sense, like if there's a compromise that can be made, or if there is for example, in one of the areas in East Asia that's really developed is this emergency arbitrator procedure, which is a 2-day or 3-day period of time where you can appoint someone to help resolve a dispute within like a very short amount of time. And so the idea being parties can elect to do this. And now this is becoming more globally accepted. There are other practices here in East Asia, like going between formal and informal mechanisms. Like we have very formal arbitration proceedings, but then there's also this comfort level with these intermediaries suggesting or offering settlement possibilities throughout the course of these formal proceedings if they observe that there's a window. Now, globally, this is becoming an area of interest. There are these working groups that are starting to look at this more on a systematic level, at the global level. This so-called mixed modes of dispute resolution is an interesting question. So this is something that you see kind of feeding up from experience, particularly from East Asia, I think. And I think that the idea is that each region has this kind of experience. So this is one particular insight or facet. And I like how Paul Lample describes like the whole earth is like this tapestry, this sort of stained glass, which is shattered. And each one is a beautiful illumination of some very vibrant picture of how we can interact. But we have to sort of see how to piece them all together. This is one piece. It's not the only piece, and it shouldn't be a dominating piece. There are other important pieces like the role of community, or the role of conservation, or the role of relationships. All of these pieces are critical, and those need to kind of feed up into how we look at problems that we face.
Good. Well, a couple of other questions we've got now. Charlene asks, how did the regional decentralization impact vertical and horizontal collaboration?
Okay. So this is a great question. So the vertical is between the global institutions, so the UN Commission on Trade Law, and say NGOs, nonprofit organizations or centers. So having this regional office allowed for meetings to take place in between so usually what happens is the UN will have 2 commissions a year for the UNCITRAL. And one will be in New York, one will be in Vienna. This allowed for what they call intercession meetings to take place in between those at this office in Korea, where NGOs and other organizations and people involved in the kinds of issues that were being discussed could come together at a more local level and say, okay, these are things we've seen these are challenges. This is maybe a suggestion. You might take this up. These are some areas where we've seen work well and may be considered by other parts, other regions as well. So they have these intermediary meetings, intercession, they call it intercession meetings. So we're familiar with reflection gatherings. We have different levels of reflection gatherings at different times, but sometimes it's in our feast, or sometimes it's at the cluster level, or sometimes it's at the national convention. So you could sort of think of it maybe in a similar way. We have, various points where different insights can benefit from maybe a more localized space for discussion. And then so once those are brought up from this sort of vertical level, at the horizontal level, you can more effectively share that learning because it's been more thoughtfully processed somehow, maybe at this regional level.
Right, and process based to some extent on regional culture and familiarity with each other. So I suppose that would also help. Barry asks a rather different kind of question. I understand that courts of adjudication have been established in selected places around the world to transcend national courts and allow these courts to adjudicate disagreements in international trade agreements. Can you comment about that?
Right. You're exactly right, Barry. There are a number of different entities that help, whether it's between investors and a state, or between states and states, or between two private parties. All three of these types of mechanisms exist. Between states has been traditionally the WTO, and there's some issues right now in terms of its own dispute resolution body, its appellate body. There's been some lack of agreement now, and so it's kind of on pause. This particular entity has had some challenges, I think, in the last couple of years. But the investor to state is a very interesting one. This is where usually states are immune from lawsuit. We can't sue a state because a state is free from is not a private person. But through various arrangements and agreements and consultations, beginning about 40 or 50 years ago, there was a center developed called the ICSID, which is International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. And most countries now have signed on to this. So this means that countries that sign on say, okay, we will hold ourselves accountable. We will be liable if we do something arbitrary or capricious to an investor who comes to our state without any reason. We just confiscate someone's property. We nationalize without any compensation. We treat someone differently than we would our own national. We will hold ourselves to account under this ICSID convention. And so investors can take a state to adjudication, to arbitration under this system and find some compensation. And so this has been ongoing for a number of years. And most states are party to this. And then between two private parties, you're right. There are also, this is more done at the private level. There are many different arbitration bodies around the world that help to resolve disputes between two private business entities. So we have the ICC based in Paris, the International Chamber of Commerce. We have the American Arbitration Association, the JAMS, the Hong Kong International Arbitration Association, Singapore. So there are many kind of regional based centers that operate transnationally, and they appoint arbitrators who help individuals resolve their disputes. I do this type of work also on a part-time basis for the Hong Kong Arbitration Center and a few other institutions to help people from different regions, usually China and US or China and Europe. Those are the kinds of cases I've had before to help find a solution and then settle or resolve through arbitration. And so that's the idea, is that this is better than outright conflict. So basically, if the alternative is, warfare, sabotage, corporate, if you have an organized method, you're going to be better off. And I think also the idea being that resorting to a local court system in another jurisdiction is unfamiliar. And so having these transnational options, whether it's for investor to states or to investors, everyone feels a bit better off because no one is in an advantageous position or an unfamiliar position. There is some sort of common ground that they're finding through these entities where they turn over their concern to a third party who operates between these countries.
Barry, as a follow-up question, how does all of this relate to the developments that you were talking about tonight? Is there a connection?
Right. So the idea is that these transnational dispute resolution bodies, they operate and they function according to principles and norms. And so the UN Commission on Trade Law is the one that helps develop the norms. They say, okay, these are the things that we think should be the steps you follow when you take a dispute to one of these global kind of transnational bodies. And so here, for example, how long should you have to respond? What are some of the approaches to evidence? What are some of the ideas in terms of the responsibility of the neutral or the arbitrator in terms of fairness? So having the ideas of these principles informed by the experience of various regions is very important, because you want this global transnational system to reflect the people it represents and serves. So if you have arbitral bodies that are serving members and individuals who have disputes across a diverse array of regions and continents and also subject matter, you want to make sure that the principles reflect all the participants in that system who are using it. And so I think that's the significance of that study. Thank you for the question.
Ruha has another question. You mentioned the idea of doing other such regional offices. Is there actually any plans to create one for the African continent or for Latin America?
Yeah, so I have several of my PhD students who are from Kenya, and actually one of them, we co-wrote an article about this idea of this sort of what are some of the steps being taken within Africa to move towards this. So that paper was written up, and I'm happy to send a link later. But basically, it's at a beginning stage. I spoke also to the head of this Asia Pacific regional office about this. What are the ideas? Exactly this question. And I think it's a matter of funding. It sounds like it's a matter of getting the resource from that regional group to support. Because globally, it seems like there isn't yet this collective will that we want richness. So it has to come from that region itself, which is unfortunate. I think when we get to this consciousness of the oneness of humankind, we will recognize at the global level it's a benefit to fund and provide resource to get more regional input, because we make better decisions. It enriches the level of our discourse. But right now, the thinking is that the regions themselves have to generate their own income and funds, and people have to donate. So this is the model that we see here, which gave rise to the development of the Asian one.
You know how much the Asian one has to spend every year? What sort of budget does it have? Do you know? That's
a great question. I'm not. So it's on an island that was set up for commercial activity in Korea. It has an office space. It has maybe 6 staff, I believe, and some countries donate staff as well. So they'll donate, like Hong Kong, I think, has one staff that it donates to in terms of contribution. But I can imagine it's hard to say. If you count the actual physical space, it could be quite significant. But that will vary. So if you're in a region where the property, the real estate doesn't cost them, then, you're going to have variation.
But an office with 6 staff is, maybe $1 million operation a year at the most, probably. So probably it's not like it's $100 million or $10 million.
No, it's a very modest scale compared to what we see in terms of the cost of conflict. If you count, the billions wasted in litigation or just senseless circles that people go around in, just to sort of chase some sort of resolution, it's very, very minimal.
Yeah.
And then you consider the outcome that you're getting more richness in terms of ideas that could be deployed in reforming and advancing some of these systems.
More money may be spent sending people there to talk together.
Right. Yeah.
Actually, which means all the countries in that sense are contributing, which is
right.
Which is good. Chitra asks whether regional voices can have an impact on creating greater equity for the global South in global trade agreements.
Yes, so this is a very, very significant and important point. So I think now what we're seeing is that there's more recognition of the inequities in trade agreements, especially between largely Western or European nations and the South, in terms of who benefits and who ends up getting, how resources are distributed, etc. In the terms of, say, investment loans. So yes, I think definitely these types of institutions can help to mediate or provide the principles to resolve the disputes that arise maybe after these agreements have broken down. We see a lot of breakdown, as interest rates rise, in Argentina, or we have projects that don't go as planned. We have fluctuations in currency. So how we address these change of circumstances and by what principle we assess damages, I think it needs to be informed by definitely the experience of those who've often borne the brunt and the burden of inequitable agreement, to see how to more equitably arrange these types of dynamics. And I understand also from this relates also to the environment quite a bit. I think there's at the recent Copenhagen summit, there was a proposal put forward by small island states, basically to look at the terms of loan agreements and to provide windows of time or moratoriums on repayment when there are natural disasters, which are caused largely by the polluting effects of major industrial power. So you have major industrial nations causing the majority, majority of greenhouse gases, which give rise to very extreme weather events, which mostly impact on nations that are vulnerable to these weather events, which are small island states or coastal states. So they say at the very minimum, we should have a pause or a freeze on any kind of loan that we have to repay to these global institutions while we're trying to sort of dig ourselves out of this mess, which wasn't necessarily of our own creation. So I think now we're starting to see kind of these sorts of ideas brought into the discussion.
That's clever. That's clever. Well, I thought I'd ask a question related to the issue of globalization, because obviously trade and globalization are rather closely connected. And there's been a lot of talk about how in the last, the pandemic and now, of course, the war, that globalization is sort of on the retreat. So I was wondering if your research, if you looked into that whole question and whether that has an impact on this particular organization.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think that there are tensions and cleavages. I think the downsides of globalization have become very clear in terms of for example, the strain on the environment, the strain on local worker, the employment situation of people around the world. Do we need to ship everything everywhere all the time? Do we need I'm guilty of this. We order from Amazon in Hong Kong certain things that we can't find here, but are all these things, can we do better in terms of finding things more locally? So the question about whether, how are these institutions, responding to globalization, or I think you definitely see a lot of the issues that are giving rise to disagreements between say, two business entities are very much due to factors beyond the nation state. So COVID was a big example of this, in terms of this was a transnational pandemic that affected how people were able to operate or not operate their business. Many people had to freeze. The cost of gasoline has increased dramatically. So what was expected in terms of what people were able to deliver was not feasible or possible. And so many things have broken down between companies or between states. And so the question is, who should bear that burden? Is it only, or should we stick to the letter of that contract, or should we recognize that there are global forces and we have to sort of look at how everyone is doing, how everyone can somehow remain afloat and continue to proceed in a fair way. So this is a tricky question that these various types of entities or dispute resolution entities are looking at.
Interesting. I don't see any other questions right offhand. This has been a fascinating topic, I will say, and one that I hope people are now much more aware of, and therefore are in the position to think about these kinds of issues and share some of these kinds of issues with their friends. I thought I should briefly mention our upcoming program before we end tonight. We have one more webinar in January, which is next Sunday at our usual 2 p.m. Time. God Summons Europe Part 2, with a course that has just begun. And the rest of the title of the course is Baha'u'llah's Proclamation to Other Powerful Rulers. And the talk next week will be on Baha'u'llah's tablet to Pope Pius IX. Subsequent classes will focus on Baha'u'llah's message to the Emperor Franz Joseph of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Kaiser Wilhelm of the German Empire. Previously, we've covered the tablets to Queen Victoria, Napoleon, and to Tsar Alexander of Russia. So that particular webinar will be at 2 p.m. as our usual time, and the course will have 2 other webinars, but those webinars will only be for people in the course. We will release the whole series in about 6 months. We have 3 courses coming up soon, all of which will be in February. On the 1st of the month, and a course on interfaith dialogue and collaboration on the 8th, Baha'i perspectives on agriculture and food, which will look particularly at how food is raised and distributed around the world. This gets into the trade issue again. And then on the 15th of February, we'll have a course on anti-Black racism in the US and building a unified society. So we have those courses coming up in February, and of course, even more in March, but we'll tell you about them at a later time. I want to thank everyone for joining the Wilmette Institute's webinar today. We hope you will share some of the ideas and information you have heard today in conversations with others, and please tell others about this webcast. We look forward to seeing you again at a future webinar. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
I think I don't know if we can shut this down other than to simply